Great, I know. Kind of as a way of introduction, I'll tell you a bit about Loops, and then we'll have Ken and Japna introduce themselves. So Loops is basically a platform that is focused on helping mostly growth, product, and data teams maximize their KPIs by identifying concrete opportunities and actions from the data. So as opposed to many other solutions out there that show you dashboards and graphs and lines that go up and down, we surface insights, concrete insights to improve your different metrics like conversion, retention, engagement, monetization, and so on. And we kind of support them throughout the process of growing their KPIs, from the analysis to the hypothesis to the action to measure the results of everything that they do and iterate on that. Maybe Japna, you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure, happy to. Morning. My name is Japna. I've been working in growth land for over a decade now. Mostly focused on B2B and B2B2C. And currently I am at Calendly helping to build a growth team and kind of help the company get to the next stage of their growth stage and their story. But prior to that, have been at a couple different companies, product board from Series B to Series D, Otter in an interim role, Dropbox. So seeing a bunch of different types of companies at different stages, and happy to share my learnings and also happy to learn from all of you today as well.
Cool. Ken, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Rudin, and I've been in the growth field for probably 13, 14 years now. Starting back then, I was the head of growth at Zynga, the online gaming company, for several years. Then I left and was one of the original directors of Facebook's growth team back around 2010 and for a few years after that. And then I went to Google to start and then lead their growth team for 5 or 6 years. And then most recently, I was at a later stage startup called ThoughtSpot, a B2B analytics company. And my role there was to help change them from a traditional enterprise sales company to much more of a product-led sales or product-assisted sales company. So I spent 3 or 4 years on that. And currently now, I am doing full-time executive advising in the area of growth.
Perfect. Thank you, Japna and Ken. Okay, cool. So I think just kind of like context or background, what triggers us to have this discussion is that, it's mid-February, most of the planning is done by now, and it's time to execute. And clearly 2024 not going to be easier given what we're seeing in the market. We look at OpenView recent report where PLG companies are actually the revenue is actually declining, I think from 45% to 29% revenue growth. Obviously, we're still seeing layoffs in the market, so growth teams are actually shrinking. So not going to be more resources. CAC to LTV ratio based on this report is actually not getting much healthier. So clearly execution is going to be a challenge with like less resources. And now it's time to see how we execute. And that's what I think the context for our discussion. And I think what we want to start with is probably understanding, how we think about like the different aspect execution. And maybe here I'm going to, approach our panelists to discuss how we think about like the definition of like, or the different aspect of execution. And one of the most popular questions that we get a lot is around thinking about like win rates of experiment, of initiatives. How do you think about that? Is that even important for growth teams to look at the win rate of their execution of the different experiments? And if so, how do you think about what things you did in your role to improve the win rate of your hypothesis? Japna, you want to start?
Sure. So win rate is an interesting metric for growth teams. I think people have a lot of opinions about what it should be and what it shouldn't be. I think it's always important before we kind of talk about the specifics that every growth team is on its own journey of maturity, and just make sure you're applying the nuance of your situation, the size of your team, the experience of your team, and also the type of company you are and the types of customers you're going after when you compare and contrast. So for example, at Product Board, it was a little bit more of a PLS type of model, and at Dropbox, it was vast majority PLG. So the way you operate a growth team and the expectations you have of success may be a little bit different depending on the type of company. So always keep that in mind. But going back to your original question, Tom, about how to increase the win rate, or how to continuously ensure that you are building more confidence in your experiments. One thing when I see growth teams, I talk to growth teams, do some advising as well, like Ken mentioned. One pitfall I see is that folks try to run experiments for the sake of running an experiment, or just say that they're running an experiment. But it doesn't necessarily come back with any substantial evidence or a strong hypothesis. And remember that having a strong hypothesis really should be backed by quant and qual data from your customers. You still have to do that product thinking and work to come up with those strong hypotheses and then develop a design to test that hypotheses. You're not just coming up with hypotheses out of thin air and saying, here's my backlog of 20 experiments, let's run them, because that's when you're going to start having a lower win rate. So always make sure that you do that step and have really strong insights behind it before you start running a bunch of experiments. And then the second thing I'd say is how you balance your portfolio of experiments at the end of the day. You don't really want a situation where 100% of your experiments are all small, tiny ones, because ultimately you're only making optimizations, and you want to grow, especially at growth stage companies, you've got to grow 2x every year. And you also don't always want to be doing large projects either, because you want to save some space for some of the smaller learning experience. So have a good balance between some of the smaller scoped experiments and maybe some of the larger projects. Smaller scoped experiments can be follow-ups to larger projects that were successful. So optimizations that you know are going to work, you have high confidence in. They can also be learning opportunities for you to understand an area you've never delved into before. And then larger ones you build a little bit more confidence, and they give you that bigger swing. So these are some ways to think about going a little bit deeper into win rate and actually just thinking about your experimentation strategy overall.
Ken, what's your take there?
Yeah, I would.
Should we care
What's
about?
that?
Should we care
Oh, yeah,
about
okay.
win rate or
Yeah,
not?
in terms of win rate.
Yeah.
In terms of win rate, I can give some examples there. I do think the main thing that the teams that I have worked with and working with now that has become really important is having not just the insight. So I totally agree with what Japna said, but to like drill in a little more. You have to have not just the insight for there's an opportunity here, but also what I didn't see people doing several years ago and what we're doing now is doing analysis to back up your hypothesis of this is how I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity, and doing analysis of how big the impact could be. So an example there's a company I'm working with called Outdoorsy. They're an RV, recreational vehicle marketplace. So it's like Airbnb, but for RVs. And searching for an RV in your area is one of the most important actions on their website. And we noticed that the search rate on their homepage was really healthy. But when you got to a listing page that would actually show a bunch of RVs, the search rate was significantly lower. And so the notion was, oh, there's an opportunity to improve that. What do we think is the difference, and so on. And first, we were looking at the differences between the two search experiences. And what it seemed like was the one on the homepage, you had these little facets that you could click on to quickly add filters of the type of RV you wanted to look for. And that didn't exist on the search page. So we're like, oh, let's add those. Historically, we would have just gone ahead and said, let's see what happens when we add these filter facets to these secondary pages as well. But what we did first was, well, that would impact the number of searches that have filters on it, or the number of filters per search. And we saw that, yes, on the homepage, the number of filters was almost twice the number of filters we were seeing on the secondary pages. So that gave us more confidence that adding in these facets to make filtering easier was going to help. And then the last part was, well, if we do that, how important is that? Because don't people just search from the homepage and they don't really need to search on the secondary pages? But a lot of people, it turns out almost a third of the people go from Google search, where they're looking for an RV in their area, directly to those secondary pages. So at that point, we had the evidence that our hypothesis about the facets might be correct, and that there was a big impact here. So we went ahead with the experiment. So I think that's just a good example of the additional analysis and the additional use of data that we're seeing now that we might not have looked at 5 or 10 years ago.
I agree, but I wanna challenge you a bit, like, before we move on, because still the benchmark out there is 20% based on what I know, and like there are many podcasts around those things, win rate, and I want to challenge you, like, first, should we care? Should we care? Like, is it, if you think about the planning, you want to do 10, like, quarterly planning, I want to do 10 experiments. If I take into account the win rate and calculate and multiply that by, the average win rate, like, side of the impact, I can think about what will be the impact of my growth team. But there are other ways to think about that. And
should we care about win rate? No, we shouldn't care about win rate. I certainly, the one time I tried that was when I was at Google and working with the Chrome team for Chrome on iOS. And we said, we're going to do 12 experiments in the next, N months. And all we did was come up with the smallest experiments that we could do. So it focused us on doing something, trivial. And then you look at the win rates, and I don't think that matters at all. What you want to look at is what's your impact. So measure yourself not on your win rate, because also it's one of the things Japna said about big versus small. My take on that is you tend to want to start with a lot of smaller ones to prove out something that you're going to invest a lot more in that would be a bigger one. If you're only doing big experiments, then your win rate better be high. If you're doing lots and lots of smaller ones, it doesn't have to be nearly as high. So it completely depends. I don't think that benchmark at 20% A is accurate, or B, even if it is, it's not meaningful. I think you have to focus on, look, we're trying to move a metric. I don't care how many experiments it takes and how many of them didn't work. It's, did you have the impact on that metric in the time frame you said you would? That's the only thing to focus on.
Okay, cool. And I think Japna, I see you nodding, so you probably agree with you agree with, like,
yeah, 100%.
cool.
Absolutely.
Another way to think about, like, execution of a growth team is velocity of hypothesis, velocity of experimentation. I know it's another kind of controversial, perhaps, theme. I can tell you kind of like a more extreme example. We've seen growth teams working that we work with that had, let's say, 2 experiments a quarter. Now, you can argue that you can do more or less, but I kind of told them, you're not, like, forget what you're gonna do. Like, with 2 experiments, and let's face it, it's not gonna, these are growth team experiments, like, you're not gonna win. Like, it just, you don't do enough even to kind of to get the impact that you want to. So how do you think about, like, velocity of growth team? How do you know that you have the right velocity? Or again, you're gonna say it doesn't matter. It's not a very good leading indicator anyhow. What's your take on velocity of, like, growth teams? Japna, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think I'm gonna say something really similar to what Ken just said for the last question as well. That velocity in and of itself is not necessarily the most important thing, because it seems like velocity and win rates are something that people talk about in the blogosphere as proxies for impact, but really you should just measure impact. And that's the most important thing. Time to impact, time to insight, time to learning. That's how you measure real velocity, not necessarily the total number of experiments per quarter. And I'll give an example. I was talking about at Product Board, we had established a growth team from scratch, and we didn't have a team before. We were building a team net new, and we grew from 1 team to 2 teams to 3 teams to 4 teams. And so my expectation of the time to learning and insight, and also how fast we could create business impact to help ultimately grow the business, increased over time. Not just as we grew in number of people, but also as we grew our muscle and we grew in the practice, and we built all this substantial data and insights over time that we could utilize to create more confident project hypotheses, and then go build those larger experiments that Ken was talking about, where you need to have the confidence. But those are the things that will give you big swing changes in impact. And then you can see, okay, quarter over quarter, my teams made this impact, this impact, this impact, and you can see velocity accelerate in time to impact. And that's what you want to get to. And it takes a long time. It's not an overnight. It's not very easy to do, and it takes a while to build that from a talent perspective and a culture perspective and a muscle perspective. But that's when someone tells me, you know, what is the velocity of growth team? That's how I think about it: accelerating time to impact and learning.
I very much agree with that. And I'll add, the next question is, okay, great. Yes, we want to be faster because I don't measure the velocity. I measure the impact, as I said, but velocity is an input to that. The faster you can move, the more impact you can have. So it's one of the levers. The question is, so how do you, if you do want to move the velocity lever, for me, the 2 biggest things I always run into that slow a team down, or growth initiatives down. First is the data. It's taking us too long to get the data to figure out if is there any support for our hypothesis, or identifying where there may be opportunities where we're seeing in a particular scenario or with a particular demographic, things aren't as good as something else, and what's our hypothesis about why that might be. And then trying to dig into that. It's hard to get that data. So the first thing, I think, and the most fundamental thing you can do to increase velocity is improve your kind of analytics infrastructure. So you want to make sure that you're logging the data. If you are running into those scenarios where, well, we can't get that data, it's going to take too long, I would stop your growth initiatives, because that problem isn't going to go away until you focus on your analytics infrastructure. So say, everybody, we're pausing a growth initiative here. We're going to make sure the logging is in place. We're going to make sure the data is accessible, and we're going to make sure we have the analysis tools. You know, this is where something like Loops can come in, where you can just point it at your data and tell it what your KPIs are, and it will start crunching and giving you the data right away. So whatever tool you use or whatever infrastructure you use, to speed up your velocity, spend time, pause everything else, spend time on analytics. And B, the second thing is, we don't have engineering resources to focus on this. And that's that one, there's no easy fix. But I think the core thing is, when you go through, or when the teams go through quarterly road mapping cycles in the product org, make sure that you or some representative of the growth initiatives is in there, so you can get some time allocated in the next quarter, so you get engineering resources that you can use to focus on these growth initiatives. So analytics and engineering resources, those are the 2 big blockers in terms of getting a higher velocity of experiments.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned my favorite keyword, which is analytics, Ken. So I should obviously refer to that. And I think velocity is important when it comes to analytics. And one of the most popular, I think, cases that we deal with at Loops is the A/B test, kind of like the A/B test disease, I would even call it. B2B companies just don't have enough time and don't have enough traffic to run many of the A/B tests that they want to do, especially down the funnel. Like maybe PLG companies sometimes have enough sign up, especially as you go deeper there. And if they run A/B tests, it would probably take them, the current traditional A/B tests probably take them at least 3 to 6 months to get some results. You just cannot, you cannot move like this as a growth team. It will slow you down. It will just kill your business. I think this is where it becomes, I think, managing velocity of execution versus other kind of like levers, other ways to, I think, Jopna, you and I discussed it, other ways to basically confirm your hypothesis, not via an A/B test. Or maybe find like ways to balance accuracy versus velocity. We are telling our team to go in 90% like significant level in some cases.
Instead of 95%, go to 90%.
You know what? I'm not going to share it too wide, but even 85% in some cases. Fine. We actually, it looks we have models to measure the impact of what you do even without A/B tests with minimal traffic. So there are plenty of ways to do so. But I do think that, you know, you need to find the right balance between the velocity of your kind of execution to the accuracy on the data and so on. It's something that we see many kind of B2B companies face.
Yeah.
And as a result, some of them just wait for ages.
Yeah, you do in B2B, I agree. You do need to call experiments earlier than you would like, even before they hit what you would traditionally consider statistical significance. And the way I kind of console myself as someone who's an analyst at heart, the way I console myself that it's okay to do that is I really see the goal of analytics in these scenarios as not necessarily being to get the right answer all the time, because to get the right answer would take 6 months, 9 months, but it's to do a hell of a lot better than randomly guessing. So if we can call it at, 85% or even 80%, we're going to be wrong sometimes, but I'd rather do 10 experiments and get, 8 right and 2 wrong, where we called it incorrectly and we still launched this thing that was worse, than do just 2 experiments and get 100% of them right. Right. The 8 right and 2 wrong is a better outcome than 2 right and 0 wrong.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Go on.
The other thing in B2B, besides calling experiments early, or kind of designing your experiment a little bit differently in order to account for the lower traffic, is having better leading indicating metrics that you can experiment on, and then having a way to monitor the impact on your ultimate business KPI at a cohort level on a longer time frame, just to make sure that that leading indicator and that lagging indicator are staying correlated with one another. And Tom, you know, I think we talked about this before, but in Loops, not only do you guys present the opportunities, but you're also able to segment and cohort out different users so that you can continuously monitor, is this leading indicator still the right leading indicator? Are there perhaps other success metrics that the growth teams, the product and analytics teams can use to see if that can drive better engagement, better retention, what have you, on that ultimate cohort? And so I think that's really useful, because sometimes you drive a leading indicator so much that it degrades in quality, and you have to kind of go back and look at the entire user journey and refresh your metrics. You have to do that every once in a while, but that's a really large undertaking, and the automation that you guys provide vastly reduce the time to that process, such that you can skip most of it. It's automated, and then you can start running those experiments again, and you can monitor that over time automatically, which is really, talking about increasing velocity is a huge value.
Yeah, I can add that, companies, B2B companies that want to move a lagging metrics, it takes, let's say, 2 or more, 3 months or so. It can be 3rd month retention. It can be cases where you have a freemium model and it takes time for users to convert. Like if they actually use the product, and we know that on average, that's not a metrics that you can optimize towards like when it comes to experimentation. Like you must find a lead indicator for that to move faster. And and that's something that, talking about velocity, this is something that good basically growth teams actually have leading indicators for the metrics that they want to move. Cool. I want to actually go deeper on this, talk about data, but let's kind of like kick off with a short poll here across our audience. Who, by the way, I haven't invited you to ask questions, but I think we wanna get to know you a bit better about the audience. So I invite you folks to join this quick poll. So we want to get to know you better about your role and what are best describe you and so forth. You can use kind of like your controls there to vote. So let's take a minute to do so.
I've noticed it's not letting panelists vote, which I'm not sure that's fair.
I, given the fact that we know the companies that you work for and you're all, I don't think it's needed, but next time, next webinar, Ken.
Okay, all right, I'll hold you to that.
Yeah. Most of the folks voted. We're waiting for a few last ones. Then we're going to talk about data a bit deeper if we didn't talk about enough. So yeah, cool. I think so most of the folks are product managers, and then we have data analysts and growth. So we have product and growth teams and data analysts. Obviously, these are some of the folks that we are dealing with. And actually, we're very interested in the collaboration between product and data teams. And then we talk about mostly the folks they have somewhere between 1K to 10K of users. That's the lion's share of the users. That's fine. I think by the way, part of the problem with experimentation and getting to stat sig is around those numbers. If you have 2K of users, it's going to take you, and especially for deeper kind of down the funnel metrics, it's still going to take you ages to run an A/B test. So yes, like we're facing with B2B companies, it's not like, really super zero, I guess, I assume, zero touch B2B that is more B2 SMB based on the numbers that I'm seeing here. So definitely the challenges that we described are really relevant there. And we'll talk about more of them later on. Cool. Let's go deeper around the data. We had our last webinar of Loops. We were talking with Casey and Adam, a term that actually I think Elena Verna mentioned it, which called data theater. So companies collect tons of data. They have great dashboards. I'm sure they look great on monitors and so on. But de facto, they are not able to translate that into decisions that actually move the needle. Actually, there was a decision that were made based on the data that we have and actually changed something in their KPI. And I think my questions to you is what kind of ceremonies or best practices or real real life examples you apply to make sure that your data that you collect and as a B2B in scale companies, B2B growth, you have enough data, I assume. What do you do in order to actually maximize the impact of your data to make sure that it's not a data theater, that you actually make a decision based on that? Ken, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think probably the place where I started a process, and it was a decade ago now, or more, a little more than that, and I'm still doing it to this day, was when I was at Facebook and at Meta. We had a weekly business review meeting that Sheryl Sandberg led with her execs, and I was one of the people in that meeting. And my role was I convinced the group there that we should start every meeting with 5 to 10 minutes of discussion on metrics, because everyone was just talking about, prior to that, it was whatever was top of mind, which is certainly useful, but I felt it would be a lot more valuable to add structure. So we had 3 main product lines at the time. There was Facebook, there was WhatsApp, and there was Instagram. And we just had 4 metrics for each of those that we thought were the top 4 metrics. And so every week I would start off the meeting 5 to 10 minutes of, so there was 12 metrics total. I would just put them up on, go to the dashboard, project it on the screen and say, here's what's happening here. Here's what happened in the last week. And here's why it happened, or we don't yet know why it happened, and we're looking into it. But that really helped people get into this data mindset. And I think having a data mindset is critical for a growth mindset, because then you start talking about, well, we did this thing. What do the numbers say? Did it actually have impact? So that's a process that I do to this day. Whenever we have a weekly staff meeting with executives or a weekly product team meeting, always start with a review of just the small number of key metrics that you can cover every week.
Yeah, Jamna, I agree
Yeah,
with you.
that's
We'll
a
talk about that. Jamna, go
yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Love the business review cadence. I actually at product board and also at Dropbox, we also had a similar type of cadence. But one thing I changed when I went to product board is I also had my PMs run a similar type of meeting where each of them owns a specific part of the funnel and they'd be responsible for reporting on and talking about the metric that they own and understanding the trends at the business level and mapping that back to some of the experiments and projects that they were running. Because I wanted to kind of train the thinking across the team, the working team, of connecting the product work to ultimately the business impact, right? And we talked about earlier, sometimes it's not necessarily about the number of experiments, it's about time to impact and actually ultimately making impact on the business. And that team is responsible for doing that. So once they see that connection and they start to study the trends in the business metrics, they'll start to understand at a deeper level, what are the types of projects that are actually more likely to impact the business metrics, and how do we ladder that up to company OKRs and metrics. So that's one thing that I added additional, but I love the cadence of doing business reviews because it helps to connect different parts of the organization together and really understand what's going on in your business. You won't have a good understanding without that. The other thing I'd add, Tom, to go back to your question about working with data teams, or product growth teams and data teams. When you're starting off, you don't always have a ton of resources, and so it's not ideal. You really have to ruthlessly prioritize where they focus. But it's always important to remember that you shouldn't necessarily treat your data team as, here's a request that I send off in Slack, and then someone comes back to me in a week with a report. That's not the best way to utilize your data team. Your data team really should be an insights team that works with you as a partner and is the quantitative version of the voice of the customer in your product process and in your decision-making process. So utilize them for insights across the entire project lifecycle. At the beginning, to help you understand and validate and form a hypothesis. Later on, when you're actually designing the solution and you want to implement it and measure it. And then when you're actually helping to conclude or synthesize the learnings from what you launched, that's a partner that stays with you throughout the entire project lifecycle. So make sure to treat them like a partner and not like a studio model request type of team.
Yeah, wow, so many great points. First, you both mentioned the weekly business review. We just at Loops, we completed a massive research on how companies do WBR or like monthly business reviews. And let me tell you something to the audience, it's 2024 and we are still seeing companies that do not do any weekly, monthly business reviews to look at their KPIs, why they are moving, what's what are we learning from that? What's the impact of our recent launches? What are we learning from that? And what are we going to do next? I find that still kind of quite surprising that good growth teams or at least aspiring growth teams don't do and obviously product and data related teams don't do WBR and MBR, and I find it as a huge kind of pitfall. And second, Jafna, you mentioned that we deal a lot at Loops with research around the relationship between the product teams and the data teams, which is not ideal. Let's put it this way: it's not ideal at the moment. In a way, still, I think product and product growth teams treat some of their analyst kind of counterparts as dashboard builders instead of insights drivers. And I think this is in a way that's what you mentioned, but if you don't build this kind of if you don't set the expectation and create the culture that actually encourage the analytics team to drive those insights, that's really a missed opportunities, because you as a product team, you don't have the full context of your data to be able to bring those insights. And that's exactly why analysts that supposed to understand the business plus understand the data, able to drive insights that no one else is able to move. So I think you are touching upon really, really good point there, which in a way kind of talks about some of the challenges of working with other counterparts. But before that, I want to talk about relationship and kind of communication with other colleagues in the organization. I want to move to another poll question around basically to hear a bit about the obstacle and barriers for growth. What are those obstacles and barriers that you experience for your product growth teams there? This one is actually the most interesting one, I guess.
This is a great question.
I think we were trying.
I wish I could.
You wish? Sorry, what?
This is a great question. I wish I could vote.
Yeah, again, Tom, we want to vote too.
Okay. So in the meantime, while we wait, Javna, tell us your as someone that leads the growth team of a great product like Currently. Well, I guess it's a few of them, right?
Yeah, definitely a few. I've seen these in different renditions too, across the board. Issues with data and data silos is actually something that we experience quite a lot at Dropbox.
That was the one I was going to pick. Right. Data and data silos. That's also why earlier I said, if you want to improve velocity, there's too many times when we just keep banging our heads against the wall that we keep complaining about data and like, why don't we just, instead of putting our resources into growth initiatives, take the next 2 months or something and figure out what we need to do with the data. Maybe even takes more than that, but then we can get back to this. But right now it was just so painful each time until you're running any experiment until we fix that. Or maybe ultimately fixing it, but just
bias to data. But let's see what most of. Okay, so
wow, it's all over the place.
It's quite scattered. Too difficult to measure the impact of our actions is like a bit, but it's just quite scattered around us. Where I guess I can relate because these are all real. We've just brought examples from real kind of voices that we heard from other companies. I think too difficult to measure the impact of our actions, which is the bigger kind of share of this pie, is something that I can definitely relate to because you just don't have, right? Like it's very hard to measure the impact of your launches because you're not able to run A/B tests. We have at Loops, we have solutions for those things, and I think basically it enables you to measure the impact of what you do without A/B tests. But there are other ways to do so. We actually have really relevant posts around those things in the last few weeks. So feel free to check out Loops LinkedIn page and also my LinkedIn page because we are talking about those things. But if you have any specific questions about those things, feel free to use the Q&A to basically to ask those questions about specific challenges because you have a great panelist here to address those things.
Tom, there's one other thing you were talking about, like processes for using data. There's one other thing that struck me that I did want to mention. There's like you were talking about how do you use data. There's a process that I think people use when they're trying to prove that their experiments worked. And it turns out there's a difference between using data and abusing data. And it's this process of cherry picking where you run an experiment and then at the end of the experiment, you look at all the data. And if you're good enough at analytics, you will always be able to find some metric that improved. And that's the one you will present and say, this experiment worked. And then magically, every experiment worked. And by the way, that's another reason why talking about which experiments worked, what's your win rate, I'm not sure is meaningful because if you, after the fact, try and figure out, oh, we moved number of users up, or we moved the engagement of users up, even though the number of users didn't go up, whatever it may be, you'll find something. And that's just kind of torturing your data until it gives you some answer that you like. So the way to avoid that is, I refer to that as cherry picking, basically. The way to avoid that is upfront state, this is the success metric we're looking for. And then either it moved it or it didn't. And that's all that you really need to focus on. So I think that's an important part of every experiment is be clear on what success means before you start it. Otherwise, everything will look successful.
Wow, 100 something percent with this. I am actually telling that we have a joke at Loops that we brought the most kind of like, I think, desired feature that we need to develop is A/B test analysis that show you why you won every time you won. Because this is what people are kind of like searching for. They won. Like they just need to play with the numbers to show that they won. But I feel like this is like something that like our customers sometimes want. Like they want to show why they won instead of like defining the KPIs in advance and kind of sticking to them. So yes, 100%. I want to switch gears to talk about a bit like work. We talked about working with analysts, and Japna, you kind of referred to that a bit. But how, one of the most popular questions that I am asking about is around roles and responsibilities of growth teams. And I want to kind of like maybe ask you about like how do you think about like working with different organization and other like departments of the organization. We're getting a lot of, I think, questions about who has the resources, engineering, design, and analysis. Do you have everything? This is cross-functional. How do you think about like what's the most successful, I think, framework or structure that could maximize the impact of a growth team? Jopta, you wanna go first? Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I think this depends on, your company stage and where you're at, but the best practices that I've seen and try to implement myself as well is a cross-organizational growth team. And there's two levels of that. One is ultimately you have accountability and responsibility to drive business impact, and there are multiple players who do that, right? So I like to meet weekly and monthly with my counterparts in growth marketing, in velocity sales, in scaled customer success. We own the integrated customer journey for self-serve or PLS. We need to make sure we're staying in contact with one another, that we are looking at the same metrics together, that we are, not providing duplicative or confusing customer experiences. And so I call all of them my growth partners. We are collectively the growth organization from a business perspective. So it's really important that you're constantly in touch with them. And there's also growth levers in there that are out of product that are really important growth levers. And also generally easier to launch experiments with as well. So when we talk about velocity, those are great channels to use. The second layer is your actual product growth team that are building the experiments and projects and changing around product functionality. And that is also cross-departmental, right? You have engineering, product design, analytics, and those folks should be kind of embedded in squad, team, whatever word you want to use, but they should all have shared goals and shared priorities and work together as a team and all be accountable for, the specific metric or specific goal that they have. And so I will always tell my teams, whenever you guys talk about your projects, I want to be able to ask any one of you what's going on, and you should know what the goal is, what you're doing, why you're doing it. Not just necessarily the product person, because shared goals and shared accountability is really important to incentivize a team to work together instead of against each other. And so those are the types of roles and responsibilities and also sense of accountability that I like to instill in my team. And we had talked about analytics earlier. Analytics is I see analytics as a core part of a growth team. And so I tend to always, if I see studio model type analytics teams, then I'll champion changing that model and that relationship to ensure that they're embedded in the team and they're working towards that shared goal.
Can a bit similar but different question. Do you have a model of like a failed kind of model that didn't work that you've witnessed of growth?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I mean, when we had the growth team at Zynga, this was going back in, this is like 13, 14 years ago. But it initially was a purely centralized team. So it was cross-functional. So we had engineers, we had PMs, we had analysts, all in this one centralized team. And that was really nice from some perspectives because we could share all the information about any experiments because, we were one centralized team. We could meet and talk about it. We had our own engineering resources and so on. But it ultimately failed, and we had to restructure it into this, what we referred to as this kind of hybrid embedded model. But it failed because one, we were trying to do all the engineering ourselves, so we didn't have to burden these other teams, and we weren't reliant on them. And I don't think there's any way around the requirement to collaborate with engineering in whatever area of the product you're running an experiment on. It is very helpful to have your own engineers, so you're not putting all the burden on them. But you didn't write that code, so you have to go talk to them. And it's best, like maybe you have two people working on it and they can put one person on it. So you don't need all three from that team, but you're going to need someone. And we were trying to do it more as a self-contained thing. It just didn't work. And then the other thing I think was more from an alignment perspective, which was we were looking at the data ourselves, and we were kind of more insulated and isolated, and we weren't aligned with what the different business groups were doing. In Zynga, we had all these different games. So we were working with all the different game teams. And Farmville was one of the big ones. We'd be looking at the data about Farmville and say, oh, we can change how much we're going to price the goods that you can buy in the game because we think that will have an impact with more engagement and so on, and maybe more monetization. And then you go talk to the team about this idea you have, and they're saying, sounds interesting, but our focus right now is internationalization. We're an English-only game. We need to get into these other languages. So basically, all that work we had just done falls on deaf ears because it's not their priority. So there kept being these mismatches of really interesting things we would find, but it wasn't aligned with their priority. So even if it was the right thing to do, we weren't going to be able to convince them to do it because they already had defined their priorities as something else. So what we ended up doing is this hybrid model where they reported into, my team, but they sat and lived with and were virtually members of, the Farmville team or whatever other game it was. And that's the model I use now, where they can still share the knowledge, because when I have a team meeting, it's still all those people because they're organizationally still in my team, but they don't spend time sitting where I sit. They sit where the other teams sit.
These are great examples. I want to actually talk about 2024 prediction, but maybe we'll do a last very quick poll questions, which even though we said maybe some of us like that it's not like relevant, but let's look at win rate of some more. I think it's more like gossiping right now. It's just experiment success rate of some of the things that we are doing. What will be? Do you have a guess, Ken and Japna? What will be the average here?
I'm going to say 21 to 30%. Well, now we're influencing the answers.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Okay.
So it's biased.
But
now,
as I
yeah,
mentioned before, I'm not a big fan of this kind of metric, the win rate.
Okay, let's wait for the last one and see the result. Do we have the results? Let's see.
I'm curious because I think most of the people said they had less than 10K users, right?
Yeah.
We have here somewhere between 21 to 30, 31 to 50%. That's some of the results. That was done some, I think, Ken, your guess. I think before we wrap up, I want to talk about 2024 growth challenges. End of last year, we had this kind of like the news coming from OpenView. Everyone talked about, I'm exaggerating for a second, the end of PLG era. And I have to tell you, many companies that we talk to are, close some of their growth efforts, say that we're going to do only enterprise, because of different reasons that we can obviously discuss. So my question to you is, what's your take around that? Given in the current macro environment, current kind of like, financial kind of situation, what's your take on the future of kind of PLG, PLS side? How do you think about 2024 from that perspective?
I mean, I can take that one. This is exactly what I was focusing on at my last company, ThoughtSpot, which is they were a classic enterprise company. But because of the macroeconomic environment, they realized their sales cycle at the time, it was about 9 months. And these were, multi-$100,000 deals. And the win rate from lead to close was not super high. And it was just very expensive, very long sales cycles. And the notion was, can we use the product to help the product sales cycle? And I think the problem is when people call it PLG, what that conjures in their mind is this notion of, oh, we have free and freemium products and it's really low cost and they never have to talk to sales. I think that still works great for some markets, but if you're a B2B kind of enterprise focused company, that's not the model looked for. And if you're saying, well, PLG doesn't apply to us, I think the expression is tossing out the baby with the bathwater. You're throwing everything out. What you really want to focus on is, call it whatever you want. I've called it product-led sales, or now even product-assisted sales. What I ended up doing at ThoughtSpot, or what my team ended up doing, I should say, is how do you layer in an ability to experience the product in a self-service way, and let anybody who wants to experience that. So we don't have to have salespeople reach out to them and then do these initial calls that say, let me tell you what our product is. If you're interested, you can try it here, and so on. We still did some of that, but now we had between 1,000 and 2,000 people coming in a week, trying it on their own just for 4 weeks. And we would have our customer success team reach out to those who were engaged. And then for those who hit certain milestones, the sales team would reach out to them. So it became the critical first section of our enterprise sales team. I would say 95% of all deals were still closed by salespeople, 3-4 years after I joined the company. But also 95% of all deals started with some experience in the free trial, where it was, a self-serve free trial. And at the end of the day, we were able to reduce the sales cycle because of that by 45%. And we improved the win rate from what we had identified as a lead. It used to be 6% from a lead to a full closed won deal, went from 6% to 13%. We still had our salespeople. We were using the product to make their efforts much more efficient.
These are great numbers, by the way, Ken. Great success story, I have to say. Japtan, do you have a take there on the future of? You also have your own challenges, I guess, it can't be of PLG as a PLG first company. But what's your take for 2024?
Yeah, and I love those examples from Ken, and I completely agree. High level, and for an example, your go-to-market model is a spectrum, and depending on your product, the complexity of the product, the type of customer you're targeting, etc., you have to figure out where you are on the spectrum. And what Ken was describing is, hey, for ThoughtSpot specifically, they were experimenting where they were on the spectrum, and then they found a lot of efficiency in using a bottoms-up motion to feed and make more efficient a sales process. And that's where they ended up having the most ROI and dollars coming from that. And that's a great story of trying to figure out, where are you on the spectrum? I think people tend to think of PLG and enterprise sales as black and white or some sort of binary comparison, but that's not really the case. There is a lot in between that you can do to experiment and drive efficiency, because ultimately everyone just wants the highest ROI on dollars spent in sales and marketing for the business, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. And similarly at Product Board, we had started very PLG, but we went enterprise very fast. We were able to command higher ACVs, and we moved to a model that we found was most efficient, was the PLS model that Ken was describing as well. We found that at product board as well. Whereas at Dropbox, pure PLG, right? Very different type of product, horizontal SaaS product. Any type of persona could use the product. So very different type of customer and very different type of go-to-market motion. Going back to your original question, Tom, around the reaction after OpenView shared their news, I think the reaction of pinning things on the PLG model was completely the wrong translation. That was the companies that OpenView have invested in, including Calendly, we're one of the portfolio companies, are still operating, are still running. We're making money. So there's no risk of us getting shut down anytime soon. It was really a symptom of having almost free money for a really long time in the economy, and not thinking about efficiency is one of your key business metrics, only thinking about growth. So when you over lever too much, and you spend way too many resources and investment in one specific key metric, and you're not thinking about sustainable growth, this is what happens, right? So this is just a normal market correction that we're in. You think about market corrections, market cycles are around 30 years long. So that's the time span that you have to think about that. So that's my hot take on the reaction. And I think it means it only gets better from here, right? For the businesses that we're working on, and for PLG and PLS and sales, it only gets better from here.
Agree. Yeah. So we're still optimistic. We remain optimistic about the future of PLG and PLS. And with that, I want to thank you, Japna and Ken, for your great insights. We can do that for ages, but we probably need to wrap up. If you want to hear more about Loops, by the way, feel free to visit getloops.ai. We just launched a few case studies for companies that we work with, including, I think, Monday and Taboola, Udocs, and so on. So feel free to visit our website and check out a few of the case studies that are really relevant to what we discussed. Getloops.ai. And please make sure to do the exit survey. We're trying to get better over time. Also, we are optimizing our growth model for webinars. So please make sure that you complete the exit survey. And with that, thank you so much, Ken and Japna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.